All right, welcome to our deep dive today. We're going deep into the world of King James onlyism. We've got this transcript from a YouTube video by Robert Breaker, and he has a lot to say about why the King James Version is the only Bible translation you should trust. Get ready, we've got some history here, some pretty bold claims, and even some number crunching.
You know what I find interesting is how this isn't just about, language. This is about a whole worldview. It's about a set of beliefs on how the Bible was passed down through time. And it really challenges some common ideas about translation,
Yeah, he jumps right into it. He says there are two main families of biblical texts, like two main branches of how we got the Bible. King James, only folks believe in the received text, also called Textus Receptus. They think this comes straight from Antioch and Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's key for them. They consider this line the most pure, the most accurate. And they contrast it with what they call the Alexandrian text, the one that modern translations are based on, which they see as corrupted,
Yeah, and he doesn't hold back. He straight up calls these modern translations the Alexandrian cult. That's pretty intense.
It really shows how strongly they feel about this. It's not just a difference of opinion for them. It's good versus evil, and King James is the good side,
So how does he back this up?
Well, he spends a lot of time talking about the translators themselves. He really praises the KJV translators, saying they were super skilled, really godly.
He makes them sound almost like saints.
Exactly, chosen for this task. And he uses that to contrast with modern translators, who he claims might not even be saved, have bad motives, even dirty hearts.
Whoa. He even suggests there might be an agenda to create a one-world religion through these modern translations.
That's a pretty heavy accusation, that one-world religion idea. It's common in conspiracy theories, and it's pretty extreme to say that scholars who are working on these translations have some kind of evil agenda. We should be careful about saying people have bad intentions without good evidence,
Yeah. But he does bring up some specific verses. He says they're missing or changed in modern translations compared to the King James. He talks about Acts 8.37, says it's missing from the NIV, claims that's a big deal.
Well, this gets us into the world of textual variants, which is something that a lot of biblical scholars have looked at. Basically, the ancient manuscripts we have of the Bible, they have some little differences. It's like a giant game of telephone played over centuries. Sometimes a word is added, sometimes it's left out.
So it's not necessarily a conspiracy, it's just that they use different manuscripts for different translations.
Exactly. Some manuscripts include that verse in Acts, others don't. Modern translations will sometimes add a footnote or even leave out a verse like this. Because the evidence is shaky, the King James is based on a set of manuscripts that happen to include it.
Okay. He also brings up Mark 1.23 and Luke 4.4. He claims modern translations change the meaning of how certain prophecies are understood, and suggests that it could even change people's beliefs.
Yeah, this goes to show that even small wording differences can lead to big differences in interpretation. And for someone like Breaker, any change from the King James is seen as a threat to his understanding of doctrine.
Yeah, it's interesting. He's so focused on these specific examples.
It shows how powerful the words of the Bible are and how attached people get to certain words and phrases. I mean, you can imagine reading the same word your whole life and then suddenly they're different.
Right.
It makes sense that it would feel jarring.
Yeah.
And it highlights the challenge of translation in general. When something has so much religious and cultural weight, even tiny changes can feel huge to people.
Absolutely. So we've talked about, these different text lineages and some of the reasons Breaker believes the King James is superior. But then he dives into something totally different. Numbers.
Yeah, this is where we get into biblical numerology, this idea that numbers in the Bible have special meanings. It's been around for a long time. Lots of different cultures find significance in numbers,
And he's particularly interested in number 7. He claims it appears all over the King James as proof of divine inspiration.
He really goes all in on this. He claims the total word count of the King James Version is 7 to the 7th power. That's a huge number. He also says that certain words appear 7, 49, or 70 times, always multiples of 7. It's catchy.
Yeah, it is catchy.
Yeah.
But is this really intentional design? Or are we just seeing patterns where there aren't any? It's like, seeing shapes in the clouds. Our brains are wired to find patterns, even if they're random.
That's the big question with numerology. It can be fun to think about, but it's not really a solid way to prove anything about the Bible.
Right.
You have to be careful about confirmation bias, just seeing what you want to see.
Exactly. Breaker also argues that reading the King James Version leads to like a deeper spiritual transformation than other versions. He uses some strong language here. He says people who prefer modern translations are less devout,
Yeah.
lacking something in their faith.
Yeah. This is tricky territory. I mean, the Bible can definitely inspire personal growth, but to say that it's tied to a specific translation is problematic. There are plenty of sincere, devoted Christians who love God and are transformed by Scripture through modern translations.
Right.
It's not really fair to judge someone's faith based on what translation they use.
It feels judgmental. Like he's saying his way is the only way.
Exactly. It comes off as a bit exclusive, like saying you can only truly appreciate art if you look at Renaissance paintings. There's so many ways to connect with the divine. Reducing it to a single translation seems limiting.
Yeah. To be fair, though, he does share some interesting stories about the history of the KJV, like the he and she Bibles, these printing errors that created slightly different versions.
Oh, yeah, those are fascinating. It shows how the Bible as a physical object has had its own adventures through time.
Exactly. He also talks about how during the American Revolution, soldiers used pages from the King James Version as gun wadding. It's a reminder of how embedded this translation is in American history and culture.
Absolutely. It's more than just a text. It's this cultural artifact that's been part of major historical moments.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at Breaker's arguments about the lineages of the text, his ideas about translators, and this fascination with numerology. And we've seen how he connects the KJV to personal transformation. And even touched on some of his quirky history. It's a lot to think about.
It really is. And it raises some big questions about how we approach the Bible, how we approach translation, even faith itself,
Right. It's easy to get caught up in these debates about which version is better or more accurate. But maybe the real question is, how can we engage with the Bible in a way that's meaningful for us without judging others for their choices?
That's a great question. I think it's good to remember that biblical scholarship has come a long way since the 17th century when the King James was created.
Right.
Modern translations benefit from more manuscripts, better linguistic tools, and a deeper understanding of the historical context.
Yeah, he's coming back to this idea that the King James translators were the best of the best.
Yeah, he seems to romanticize the past a little.
Like he doesn't really want to acknowledge that scholarship has advanced since then.
Exactly. And while we can appreciate the KJV's historical significance, it's important to recognize that it is a product of its time.
Okay.
And modern translations have a lot to offer, too.
What about those textual variants? He makes such a big deal out of them. Like any difference from the King James is intentional corruption.
Well, it's important to remember that those variations aren't necessarily signs of a conspiracy. They often just reflect genuine differences in the ancient manuscripts themselves. It's like having different drafts of a book. They might have slightly different wording, but they still tell the same basic story.
So it's not as black and white as he makes it seem.
Exactly. The Bible has this rich, complex history, and exploring those nuances can actually deepen our understanding.
I like it. So where does that leave us? It feels like we've been given this very specific perspective on the King James Version, one that's full of passion and conviction, but maybe a bit too rigid. What do you think? As someone who's studied the Bible and its history, what's the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the key is to remember that the Bible is a complex and multifaceted book. And there's no one right way to approach it.
It's not a simple instruction manual?
No, it's more like a conversation. That's been going on for centuries.
And we can all participate.
Exactly. We can all participate in that conversation, regardless of what translation we prefer. The important thing is to approach it with humility, with curiosity, and an open mind,
It strikes me that Breaker really emphasizes the beauty of the language in the King James Version. He talks about its majesty, how it just seems to resonate with people on a deeper level.
Yeah, there's no denying that the KJV has a very poetic quality to it. It's influenced so many writers and poets and even musicians over the years. Those rhythms and phrases have really become part of our culture.
Yeah, he uses this analogy of how people used to dress up in their best clothes for church. And he suggests there's a connection there between outward appearance and inward devotion. Like the way you dress reflects how seriously you take your faith.
Interesting. Maybe he's romanticizing a bit, looking back on a time when things seemed simpler, But it does make you think about how the language we use can shape our experiences.
And then he contrasts that with what he calls the fruitiness of modern translations.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Like they're somehow watered down or less serious.
He really seems to connect the translation you use with your character, which is a pretty big leap. It's
Yeah.
like saying people who listen to classical music are more sophisticated than people who listen to pop music.
Right.
You can't really reduce someone's spirituality to their translation preference.
It feels very dismissive.
Yeah, it is. There's such a wide spectrum of faith experiences.
Yeah.
And it's important to respect those differences.
Right. It feels like he's setting up this hierarchy with the King James at the top and everything else beneath it.
Yeah, I see that.
But shouldn't the point be to engage with the message, regardless of the specific wording?
Absolutely. It's about connecting with the deeper meaning and letting it shape your life. And that can happen through many different paths.
It's also worth remembering that even the King James Version wasn't universally loved when it came out. It faced its own criticism and controversy, just like modern translations do today.
Oh yeah, that's fascinating. History often repeats itself. What's seen as radical or unorthodox in one era can become the established norm in another. The King James's journey from newcomer to classic is a perfect example of that.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this world of King James onlyism, I think the main takeaway is this. The Bible is a powerful and complex book that has touched countless lives. How we choose to engage with it, through which translation or interpretation, is a deeply personal choice.
And it's a journey that we should approach with curiosity and humility and an open mind. It's about seeking understanding, not just certainty, and recognizing that our own interpretations are just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
And maybe, just maybe, it's in those spaces where the pieces don't quite fit, where the questions linger, that we find the most profound truths.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's in that mystery and wonder that faith truly comes alive.